is independent landlords who also get to decide whose leases get renewed open up for a huge amount of subjectivity, of racial bias, and of bureaucratic failure. More on this in my points. Before that, let's get into my stance and make a few notes on framing. Notably, panel, much of this will implicitly engage with and challenge propositions' practical analysis. So first, we believe governments often have bad incentives, and that means that their allocation of land is largely unjust and inequitable. However, if we accept propositions' claim that the governments can use their power over land to do things like increase affordability or habitability, then we can claim that in those cases, governments in our world will support positive policies like building affordable housing, taxing vacant, unproductive land, or preventing speculation of real estate. Uniquely, in props world, however, there will always be politically beneficial motives to oppress, to discriminate, or to manipulate residency in housing regions for voting. In those situations, prop uniquely empowers the state to commit this harm. Prop benefits are therefore non-exclusive and their harms are immense. Second, prop is not a world where no one owns land. Prop is a world where there is only one landlord, he's the state, and he is not very nice. We advocate for a balance where governments can still own significant amounts of land they've used for projects in the public interest while still having a system of private ownership. So we say this looks like the US, which is a country with extremely powerful private property values, but the federal government still owns 20% of all land. With that said, my first constructive point on harms to minorities. The thesis here is that states are likely to use this power to harm vulnerable minorities. Two reasons. First, let's set some context for the nature of intergroup relations in most countries. Two things are true. First, in every society on earth, a single racial or ethnic group dominates the politics, the culture, the economics of that country. So in countries like the US, this can take the form of entrenched white supremacy or disparities between Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. Second, an important lead to irrational and ideological attempts to harm the minority group. In practice, this leads to governments using the power that prop gives them to unjustly harm or punish these vulnerable groups. No, thank you. Importantly, in the cases when government also allows them to use this goodwill to implement progressive and policy that empowers minorities. But in cases when governments have bad incentives, property rights can often protect them from unjust government intervention. Second, it's important to note that the vast majority of racial or ethnic disparities in terms of land in the status quo that you yourselves point out are a consequence of historical racist intervention by the state rather than by private markets. It was colonial states in South Africa that denied even successful people of color the ability to live in communities where property values increased over time. In countries like the US, it was projects like the Homestead Act, where the state allocated land that by design refused to sell homes to African Americans and gave them out for free to newly arrived European migrants. The government failed to protect the rights of minorities while the private market was willing to help them succeed. That said, my second point on harms of state ownership. The thesis here is that states have perverse and discriminatory incentives that produce bad outcomes when they control land. So let's begin with the proposition's best case, where states have good incentives. We think even in these cases, governments are structurally incapable of making good or efficient choices. Governments have imperfect asymmetrical information regarding the demand for particular goods, the supply of land, the preferences of individuals. This means when making decisions, bureaucrats in capital cities may overprice these leases, price them too low, or create requirements for development that do not fit the demands of the population. So even when states have some access to this information, these preferences and needs are extremely dynamic and rapidly change, which means a slow and complicated bureaucracy is unlikely to make correct choices. We see this already in countries like China, where governments incorrectly predict housing demand and therefore build hundreds of thousands of housing units and other development at immense cost that, due to this imperfect information, have largely been unused to this day. When prices of land use are set by free markets themselves, they're more likely to cater to the specific and constantly changing needs and preferences of the public. But also, as history has shown us, the worst scenario is far more likely. Governments are often not well-intended, and we think they will likely act in harmful ways. Why is this? First, governments often have pernicious short-term political and financial incentives, and a monopoly on the right to control the access and distribution of land allows them to exploit these very interests. Governments who may want to raise immediate short-term revenue to fund projects, eliminate deficits quickly, or other political goals can use their control over prices in order to extract this money from citizens. Importantly, not all contracts renew at the same time, so most people will not be impacted by this at the same time, and therefore political blowback to this will be limited, but those who are impacted very intensely. Second, many regimes have significant corrupt or undemocratic incentives that are emboldened and empowered by giving them power this immense. In weak democracies, just as populists have instrumentalized other tools of state power to crack down on opposition, proposition would empower Viktor Orban to deny reasonable lease prices to newspapers that refuse to publish positive news about him. They can similarly enrich political allies and oligarchs by giving them preferential access to the most valuable, the most profitable land. These oligarchs, in exchange, advance the political interests of leaders and create an undemocratic and inefficient cycle that consolidates power in the hands of leaders, in the hands of elites and bureaucrats, to the detriment of the rest of society. Property rights guarantee protection from the government overreach and abuse and limit the concentration of power in elites. Finally then, even if the immediate government the proposition uses to implement this policy is a benevolent one, they create the potential for abuse by future administrations. The expansion of the power and intervention ability granted to the Obama administration, for example, empowered Donald Trump to abuse that power. Unless proposition can guarantee that no government will ever have bad incentives, they can't justify giving states this power so incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, judges, are we good to move on? Perfect. I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the second speaker from side proposition to continue the case.
Anyone hear me? Panel, in Ghana, the government doesn't suck because the government has managed to implement free universal healthcare for its people. Yet in Ghana, 39% of people are homeless because the Ghanaian government doesn't own any of the land in its country. It was bought up by rich Western MNCs. We think it was telling that Side Denmark didn't want to talk about any countries apart from the extremes. We think it was also telling that I'm going to have to do 4 things in this debate. I'm going to give you substantive as to why land ownership increased and continues to perpetuate the wealth divide. I'm going to respond to the material we heard from side opposition. I'm going to deal with the limited responses. But firstly, panel, I'm going to clear up what this debate is about. We think, given proposition is being required to deal with a completely different historical world, it is perfectly reasonable for us to say what we think that world would have looked like. What we think OP can do is not have the same fiat as PROP. They are allowed to have small, plausible changes. The idea that they can have massive sweeping changes to social housing system simply doesn't fit with this. It was telling that Denmark didn't read slide 16 of the judge's briefing. It was telling that Denmark never engaged with our world. And it was telling that they didn't even want to talk about their own private markets. Why do we think that we are able to get independent housing boards on our side? We think we are, apart from the fact we're literally able to fiat this in, given we are talking about a different world, we think that countries have incentives to have voluntarily created these panels. 4 reasons. A, we think when governments own land, the perception of government's responsibility to provide housing is very, very different. We think it becomes a social expectation that all people have a home and there is an independent board. We think this probably looks like something like the Supreme Court in the US, something that even when you have Donald Trump in power is able to assure the rights of women to access abortion. It looks like an independent bank. We think this independent board would be the same thing. B, we think all government services are already subjected to other independent boards. We cite the bank, we cite the justice system. C, we think the international business community would put pressure on countries without independent housing boards because they want to have the assurance that it's basically stable. We think this is the status quo and independent banks. We think developing countries have an incentive to do this. D, we would almost certainly consider ethnically discriminatory housing distribution as a human rights abuse and place international pressure for that to change. Good, let's get on to the actual debate, but I'm going to deal with them in their very best case. What did they say in response to Joe's material? Joe brought you a principle. He brought you a principle about how no one should own a piece of the earth. He told you that the current distribution was unfair, that it was a representation of historical abuses, exploitation of resources, and pure luck. We just wish this never would have happened, and we also wish that these historical events could not be encoded in current property rights. The POI saying it was due to government power all happened in their world when you had private property rights. We think it is worse that it is still encoded in current values. We think that governments holding trust in land is very different to individuals holding land because they can't buy and sell it. We think it is perverse that those transactions take place in the first place. We also think that governments broadly represent society. Much of the problems come from individuals competing. Note, panel, that the fact that they didn't respond to this principle is very damaging to their side because it is non-contingent, because there are some things we entrust in the body of the state, even if the government at that point in time in a country is bad. We think this looks like the same as police forces, armies, or allowing China to provide healthcare to its citizens. There are basic necessities which states have a right to provide, regardless of their abuses, which we think we can deal with separately. The fact that some governments abuse this policy doesn't affect the moral imperative that Joe brought you. It was a duty of the government, it was non-contingent, and it wasn't good enough when they didn't respond. Joe brought you? Joe brought you that less homelessness would have happened. He told you homelessness was awful. He gave you 4 reasons why the governments can't solve this under the status quo. And he told you it changes when there's a massive political incentive because people vote on it. He told you it changes when the perception of the government fundamentally changes as they're the ones with the duty to provide your house. He told you it changes when all governments want to reduce homelessness because that's what invites FDI in. That's what makes people think that a country is safe. He told you about a huge cognitive shift. And the only engagement panel we got was that it was non-exclusive. They could also have it on our side. He then clearly ignored the 4 reasons why the status quo was the barrier. They ignored the fact that land is expensive because it's finite. They ignored the fact that developers want to build expensive houses because it's expensive to develop. That land is expensive so the poorest can't access it. And that property owners lobby governments to stop building houses. That they have huge financial power. Panel, they didn't engage with Joe's material. That alone means they are doing very badly. What did they bring then? They told you that governments will allocate houses in a discriminatory way. 3 responses. Firstly, we point to our independent board. We tell you it looks like the Supreme Court in the USA at their very best case, which even then it has political influence, still holds decent levels. Secondly, we think even supporters of Bolsonaro are limited in how they behave by public opinion. We think there's a basic human expectation that people should get housing. And we think mass racist relocation is incredibly unlikely and a huge thing to do. When governments have that perverse incentives, they probably do it on both sides of the House panel because they have the army on both sides. We also thirdly tell you that private markets are also racist because when housing is so crucial, using existing racist financial systems to access it is problematic. They then tell you that the private sector is better at building houses. Well, actually, they didn't really. They just said the private sector is efficient. We tell you, actually, governments have structural incentives to build properties rapidly, like Joe tell you, whereas the private sector's only incentive is one that is financial. We think when the bad example they bring you is China bringing too many houses, that's better than people
dying on the street? Why do we think that land ownership increased and continues to perpetuate the wealth divide? I'll take the yes.
Historically, when we've put governments in charge of land distribution, the outcomes have been detrimental and discriminatory. We saw this with the Tutsis in Rwanda and the Homestead Act from the USA. Why won't history repeat itself?
Panel, that was also in their world where property rights happened, where property rights existed, because when the government says racist, as the Hutus in Rwanda, they used the army to kick the Tutsis out. Please be comparative. Look, we think we live in two worlds. The world of people who own land, where their primary expense is their rent for housing, where half of Hong Kong flats cost more to rent than 70% of median household incomes, and the world of those who inherit land and are born not having to pay for rent. When their number one expense is removed, the people in this second world are able to gain more property by letting their housing prices inflate, being able to purchase yet more land, and not having to spend anything on rent in the meantime. It's a cycle where those born rich can increase wealth by literally not lifting a finger and merely exploiting the rents of others. We think even if you massively redistributed things, this is something that's cyclical and inherent in property rights. To have some people born into owning a piece of the earth, whilst families in Hong Kong save away 70% of their income for a roof over their heads panel is wrong. I urge you to propose.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. When the judges just give me the all clear, we can move to the opposition speaker too. Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Perfect. Yes.
Panel, the problem with the proposition case is that they spend 15 minutes talking about how great affordable housing is, how regrettable homelessness is, but just 2 lines on why this might be solved when you surrender private property. The reason Team England is losing is because they not once engage with the actual corrupt incentives of states that are so prevalent in today's debate. A few things in the speech. Firstly, on framing and the proposition's choice of model. Secondly, in refutation, dealing with both good states and bad states and what this is going to look like in those worlds. And then lastly, on my own substantive on development. On their model, Prop decides to implement this leasing system in a relatively long-term fashion with like up to 100 years, right? Some of these even being renewed. I understand that this is an attractive path for them to follow. It allows for some stability for people to like build long-term projects maybe, but this absolutely undermines all of the equality analysis. People still can build lots of wealth, become wealthy, extract rent out of people on their side. I'm so unsure about why this is exclusive under us of the House when they enable these long-term leases. But secondly, I'm also going to explain to you in my split why the ability to accumulate wealth intergenerationally is an important development incentive and that they cannot claim productivity under their side of the House. On framing quickly, I think that on both sides of the House, governments are interested in power. And the important thing to note here, panel, is that the best manifestations of this pursuit for power look like states undertaking broad political interests that benefit all classes, like preventing foreign speculation, environmental regulation, providing affordable housing. But these policies that ultimately result in the exact same benefits that Prop claim, do not require the abolishment of property rights. So what we have to prove in this round is that there are unique harms to government ownership. What were some of these harms? Now, we've took them at their best, right? We said that even when states mean well, they are structurally incapable of making efficient choices because of their imperfect information regarding supply and demand. Now, I think they tried to preemptively mitigate this by saying they're going to have this independent board. But I would say that all of their analysis about states catering to the poor, about being in touch with local communities, about democratic accountability is absolutely lost. Why? Because this motion requires a large and powerful agency, or giving a large and powerful agency the ability to make allocation choices and prices, etc. This is going to be run by bureaucrats, not directly accountable politicians. These are people that are going to be structurally independent from a duty that proposition asserts this board may have. These bureaucrats are likely going to be captured by elites who maybe wish a generous case-by-case revision. So I think the dichotomy in good states is between bureaucratic elites who are appeasing the Trump administration, just like the Supreme Court and status quo is appeasing the Trump administration now. And the dichotomy then on our side is that you have a somewhat democratically accountable legislature. So I think even in liberal democracies of this world, land is unlikely under their side to be equitably distributed. I think that takes most of their case. But what was the more feasible characterization of modern states that we gave you? This was not extremes panel. This was Modi's India. This was Erdogan's Turkey. This was Orban's Hungary. This was where you empowered these states and their corrupt incentives. This would look like things like denying leases to newspapers who may not print things in that were portraying you favorably, or just like funding projects, right? We think this can look like you just perniciously hiking up prices of houses and leases, not actually provoking any backlash because their leases don't expire all at the same time. So you are able to do this very perniciously. These countries are important, panel. Why? A, because numerically they make up a large part of this earth, and secondly, because they are increasingly making up a large part of this earth. I think next election, I can't guarantee that Denmark or Germany or France or Canada is going to be a country that is not also subject to the whims of these politicians. Now, in addition to all of that, we explained to you why this was likely going to particularly hurt minorities, not a single line of response. Why? Because by far the most politics and economics of countries are dominated by ethnic majorities. This manifests into ideological agendas against minorities. Here it is uniquely property rights that protect them from state intervention. Just look at the moments in history where we have surrendered property rights. Yes, panel, because apartheid in South Africa or the cases in Rwanda were cases where the state took over land allocation. And this was where this was used to harm minorities, to artificially deflate real estate value in disenfranchised communities. When the state has had power, they have always exploited it. That was what the reality that had to be engaged with. I'm just going to deal with this relatively under-analyzed point they bring you in the last 30 seconds of their speech and preempt where this might have gone. So I think this basically was saying that intergenerational wealth, is problematic. The first thing I just want to say here, I'll take it in a minute, is that vacant property taxes and the lack of productivity on land is absolutely something we probably have the fiat power to support as well in a world where they have a government that is incentivizing production. But secondly, before I move on to my second reason, I'll take a POI actually.
Private market has kept 39% of Ghanaians homeless. How does this change on your side?
I think in countries where there's incentive to appease foreign bodies coming in, it is very likely that those bureaucratic boards that are going to be captured by those powerful Western elites is probably a wash in that case. But additionally, I just want to end up and uproot any of this analysis about intergenerational wealth. Because what they tell you is that this is going to be so different under their side of the house. But really, I think this is rooted in historically governments giving preferences to certain groups. They were allowed to build wealth and carry wealth into the future. On top, states would still have done this and probably more likely would have done this, allocated land disproportionately to the same groups. I think this takes down all of their analysis and any two-dimensional principle they may have had about the lottery of birth, because I think under their side of the house, historically, these kinds of land boards have absolutely also had incentives to give land, the best land, to like elites and to certain groups in society. They have to come up here and explain to me why historically that wouldn't have been the case either. What is my third substantive then? It's on better development, and I'm going to prove to you why the aspect of inheritance and intergenerationality can be important and is important when it comes to development incentives. This is also going to clash nicely with anything they might have on the developing world. The easy of this point is that without private ownership, the incentive of capital being invested in socially beneficial long-term projects is diminished and instead spent in less efficient and less productive ways. Capital today, panel, could be invested in any kinds of different kinds of areas. But what is important is that it is uniquely when you have land, when you have a promise of a return on profit in terms of generations, that you might actually promote people investing in this land. On proposition, they don't allow investors to own their land in the long term or extract profits from it for a period longer than the contract. They similarly threaten to take away all of the investment these individuals have made in their contracts, which are not reviewed. Projects then require significant upfront costs and are unlikely to be invested in. Things like skyscrapers, malls, or other significant infrastructure, all of which require tens of billions of dollars in initial investment and take decades to become profitable, will no longer be built. Denying society the immense productive potential of this investment is something they uniquely have to defend. But additionally, the impact of these changed incentives are particularly harmful and pernicious in the developing world. Developing countries are both deeply in need of foreign investment because they lack the domestic capital to grow their economies, and notably are disproportionately dependent on land-based investment because their economies are underdeveloped and lack industries such as tech or service. This means when foreign companies feel as though their investments in the developing world are not safe or unlikely to be able to yield profit in the long run, they will simply choose to invest in non-land-based assets in richer and more developing countries. The impact of this is massive. Developing nations rely on this investment to build their tax base, fund social services, and escape poverty. I actually think that the people in Ghana, lots of them have benefited from the employment and the capital invested by MNCs. That is a benefit that we have on our side of the house, an incentive they remove. So proud to oppose.
Judges ready? Thank you. I now call upon the third speaker from side proposition to continue the proposition case. Here.
Is this all audible for everyone?
Yeah. You're quiet, so just speak up a little bit louder. Yeah.
Sure.
Perfect.
Just okay. Panel, this debate came down to one very simple question. Who caters best to the majority of individuals living in countries who need housing provided to them? Is it the government or is it private markets? It is for this reason that it's problematic that throughout Team Denmark's positive case, not one line of defense of private markets was mounted anywhere in their mechanism, anywhere in their analysis, not a line of explanation as to why exactly the real-world examples which they continually refer to in their case, yielded by that system of private ownership, are defensible, are morally justifiable, and are better than our alternative. Incredibly proud for that reason to propose. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. Firstly, is the private ownership of land principally unjustifiable? Spoiler alert, yes it is. And do we, in a world where that private ownership did not exist, see reduced homelessness and poverty? We do see that panel. Incredibly proud to propose. Let's look at this first question of whether the private ownership of land is principally unjustifiable. Because Joe gave you two extremely sophisticated lines of principled analysis that got almost no engagement from Team Denmark. He told you firstly, point blank, that individuals have no right to outright own a piece of the earth. That is not something that any living person can claim to. That is something that belongs to the commons, belongs to the community as a whole, and therefore to the state. And he secondly told you that the private market has caused and perpetuated structurally abusive and inequitable distribution of land through the forces of colonialism, through the forces of corporate plunder, which I'd just like to note, no thank you, Team Denmark bizarrely defended in their last speech, and through a birth lottery that means access to valuable land is determined by whether you're born in the rich West or the impoverished global South. What engagement did this receive? Two lines, panel. Firstly, represents the collective community of a particular society. That is a shared collective ownership, not an individual one. Then they tell us that property rights protect ethnic minorities and states have allocated land in problematic ways. If it's the case that property rights have protected ethnic minorities, I am baffled as to why the vast majority of African Americans are not able to buy their own home. I am baffled as to why credit scores consistently place individuals from impoverished ethnic minority communities at the bottom of the pile in terms of gaining access to things like mortgages. They needed to do a little bit better than that when the poorest individuals, the individuals they said they cared about, who are most discriminated by their states, who are most discriminated by the private markets, are either left homeless, where they're not able to do things like access employment under the status quo, or in a system of perpetual renting, where putting 70% of their income into the pockets of a white private landlord every year means that they cannot save. Instead, this system of rent seeking, where simply by owning a house, no thank you, you can accumulate wealth, is something that entrenches white elites, that entrenches power. A line from Liberty's case they never responded to, beyond glibly saying that she expressed it briefly. Not much more needed to be said, panel. Let's then look at what they brought us substantively in terms of principles. They told us that states are corrupt and would have distributed this land preferentially along racial grounds. Therefore, states should not be given that land, or should not have been given that land in the first instance. Note that this has occurred in their world through the private market, as I've already analysed for you. But note also that within our mechanism, we made provision for independent boards like the Supreme Court in America, which has, contrary to the blatant lie from Team Denmark, actually curtailed Trump's attempts to erode Roe versus Wade. What response we received? A simple assertion that structurally independent bureaucrats, I have no idea what those three buzzwords lined up together means, panel, will take over these boards. Note that that hasn't happened in the vast majority of countries they talk about, like Brazil, like America, like Rwanda, where they have, panel, shock horror, an independent judiciary. We're happy to use the same system in order to monitor the government's apportioning of this land. But let's note how this principle ultimately collapses in the debate. Liberty told you, with no response, that the state has a principal right to things like a police force and an army, regardless of how an individual government that is presiding over that state happens to use that resource, right? They have a duty to provide things like healthcare, they have a duty to provide things like policing, and we curtail the activities of individual governments through things like robust human rights doctrine. Unless Team Denmark's third speaker is going to give us all a bit of a shock and stand up and counterprop the purge from her third speech and advocate for states with absolutely no power over their people whatsoever, no army and no police force. Not only do we get massive discrimination on their side of the house, which is uncomparative, but also the question that you have to ask yourselves in order to resolve this principle, panel, is the issue of homelessness, is the issue of housing sufficiently important to place it with all the other things like the protection of individuals from crime, like the provision of healthcare that we regard as state duties? When 1.6 billion people live in slums or are homeless, we say that it is. Note that that is a non-contingent principle that you weigh heavily in this round, because the duty of a state to provide something doesn't necessarily rely on the quality of that provision, but instead is a fundamental obligation the state has. They never engage with the sophistication of that principle. Let's look then at the second question of what would have happened in a world where government holds all land in trust, and would we have seen a reduction in homelessness and poverty? A couple of things to note here. Note what Joe tells you about the exorbitant cost of land in the private market, which is prohibitive to precisely the kinds of accumulation of wealth by ethnic minorities and impoverished communities that they describe, but also the structural incentives he gives you of people who own land in the private market to deny that to others, versus the entirely conceptual change we see, or would have seen on our side of the house, had property always been conceived of as something that should be offered as a government duty. What engagement did this receive? First, Team Denmark just asserted that governments are structurally incapable of making these complex choices. We explained to them that many states they mischaracterize as bureaucratic and inefficient, like Ghana, have things like means-tested healthcare systems, but also that the huge amounts of money that come from this private property market probably can be distributed by most countries in such a way that this can be done fairly well. But then they bizarrely contend that the problem that we'll have in our world is an overbuilding of housing. Given our objective is to end people having to live in slums, given our objective is to end people having to live without homes, we say that's a pretty good thing. Note that not one line, though, in their substantive case actually addressed the private market. Because when they told you that governments have bad incentives, when they told you that governments are cronyist, and when they told you that governments have incentives to artificially increase rent, note the caveat here, panel. Private companies do all of those same things, they're staffed by all of those same elites, have all of those same profit-seeking incentives, and all of those same short-term obligations to investors. What then is the difference on our side of the house? Every state in the world, panel, is accountable to some extent to its people. Every state in the world has to face them at the ballot box, has to face them in the streets, and has to live with those people's understanding of that state, rely on the people of that state for power. We tell you that in a world where land and property had always been conceived of as fundamental rights to be distributed out by the state, we would see people demand that given to them properly in a way that they never could against a private market that does not care, that discriminates against them and leaves them in a slum. We are so proud to propose.
All right, good. Perfect. I thank the speaker for their remarks. Now call upon the opposition third to continue the debate for the opposition side here.
Can everybody hear me if I speak like this?
Yes.
By the way, I prefer non-verbal POIs. I'll just continue so I can see you. Just a second. There we go. I honestly wish I lived in the world of proposition where I could count on every single government in the world to provide with my basic needs, to not put their own incentives for power and their own yearning for that at the top of that, of all of their ideas, at the top of every single thing they do. Unfortunately, do not live in that world, and team proposition just wave a magic wand and nice to their citizens, proud to oppose. In my speech, I'm going to be looking at three main themes. Firstly, on the government as an actor, then on inequality, and lastly, on the productive land use. But before that, let me just deal with their principle about unjust land use. They tended to blow up, given that they mostly didn't think they could win on practicals. What did they tell you? They told you that the idea that you should never own land because that it's unjustified, that it had been stolen or exploited, and that there are certain things that the state needs to provide. Note here, Maiput already told you how that idea and that principle is fundamentally undermined by their own model. Because with that logic, they would not have where you can give them maybe 100-year lease and exclusive rights to that property. They would have to be commune-based and no one having rights to specific land. This is not the case. They said that the government would own and give people rights to claim land for their own. They can still exclude people, exclude people from having rights to those lands, from enjoying the fruits of those lands. So the principle that they want to uphold that much doesn't really stand with their model. Lastly, we also told you about the property rights that has nothing to do with, for instance, the private market and everything to do with government misconduct. It was state allocations, no thank you, that there were state allocations that denied Black people access to good land in South Africa. It was state allocations that stole indigenous people's lands. Their world facilitates that. Now, the only real response we heard here was, oh, that happens in our world as well. But note that these things were breach of property rights, not something that we support. And I'll note further on this in the next theme, where we talk about what the government will actually do. But at the top of this theme, some few notes. We tell you that the state's primary objective is to preserve their power, which means that proposition only gets their benefits if they align with that incentive. We say this is the case for a lot of the benefits Prop wants to claim because there are broad political interests that benefit people across political classes. No, thank you. These are things like environmental policies, so not poisoning your water, or avoiding speculation that drives up prices and makes housing in specific areas excessively unaffordable, and important public transportation. In that case, so, on their highest ground, we say that the incentive for the state to enact such things exists on both sides of the house, meaning that almost all of their benefits are non-exclusive and can be extended on both sides of the house if we believe their classifications of governments being so benevolent and being good. But in cases where this incentive to preserve power does not align with the public good and manifests in worst ways, so if the government is discriminatory or oppressive or in the pockets of rich people, we say that they, on their side, they are amplifying the harms that we brought to you down the bench because it empowers the state to not be accountable for other people, and it removes protections of your property. This is a unique harm that loses in the debate. Now, why can they not win on their highest ground alone? Firstly, because this is a minority of cases. We already told you how there are a lot of different states around the world that do not have these grand incentives, also have other bad ones. Secondly, because even the states whose incentives are good can change, fall victim to populism, and get a new leader or be influenced. We told you this in Anna's speech, Maiput repeated it, and I'm telling you this now. Thirdly, we say that given that this is supposed to be a comparative of two worlds, they cannot just cherry pick which parts of the world to focus on. In order for them to prefer their world, they would have to engage with this worst case scenario as well. Now, what did they tell you? They gave you this point about, no, thank you. They gave you this point about lower rates of housing, of homelessness, where they talked about how because of rich people lobbying the government, or because there will be no help for them on their side, they would have less homelessness. Note here that lobbying will happen to a worse extent on your side, because if you want to ensure that the state essentially has control over every single plot of land that is dealt out, they would have to outsource this to certain bureaucrats that we talked to you about. These experts in zoning laws, these experts in what you can use this land for, meaning that it will no longer be politically accountable to who you give these to, meaning that the regulators, the people who will have this, more susceptible to influence of elites. They are not accountable to democracy, which means that they can't just assert that the rich won't just do whatever they want on their side of the house. What did we tell you? Firstly, we talked to you about harms to minorities, about the dominating ethnic group and the ideological harms that can come to minorities. Now, they only just wanted to point to a board such as the Supreme Court that can help them. Note here that we told you this board was long shot from perfect, and furthermore, their idea of courts massively falls to our side, because right now, we have property rights that you can use to protect yourself, no thank you, and uphold your own rights. For instance, when you as an indigenous group, for example, wants to appeal to courts to not let the state put an oil pipe on your sacred land, we say in those cases, when you have rights to uphold and rights to support yourself, the burden of proof falls on the government. But if you have to go to court and say the government is discriminating against me, the burden of proof falls on you, which means that you have extremely hard. It's extremely hard for you to actually get those benefits, meaning that it is far easier for them to actually hold the courts accountable. So we have already proven that in their world, there will be more unjust and ineffective allocation of land, especially given the fact that they never dealt with these short-term incentives and the undemocratic incentives that they wanted to talk to you about. There will be no real responses here. They still stand. Okay, then let's move on to inequality, a pretty short theme because they didn't really build it up, but before that, sure.
Why do you support any government services from these states, including the regulation of the property market, on your side of the house if these problems accrue when states become involved?
Because here's the thing, there's a fundamental difference between having regulations, certain oversights, and having to pass laws that are susceptible to democratic accountability versus having absolute power over who gets land. I don't think that's hard to understand. They wanted to talk to you about wealth inequality. We told you we can address that through property taxes. I've already explained that, and that it was rooted in historic preferential treatment. So let's be charitable and pretend they actually developed this point. What would this look like in their world? We said that in 1950s United States, they wouldn't be able to just wish away the problematic history, meaning that the government would largely still favor white people, still give them the good land, still allow them to build that wealth. And over the course of those years, these white people would be able to invest in other things to ensure that their children got the best education, diversify their assets. So even in the very best case scenario, where they are somehow having a great government right now, we see that this intergenerational inequality would still exist. They cannot win an intergenerational inequality. Then let's look at the productive land use. I think it was very telling that they didn't really try to engage with this. We said having development, jobs, it was specific that you would have to provide all the things that are needed for you to have a good life. Let's stay with their examples of the worst countries. For instance, Ghana being taken over by multinational companies. The problems existing for these countries are a result of colonialism that left them extremely vulnerable. They can't wave a magic wand and wish away the fact that this time in history left them vulnerable and unable to build themselves up, meaning that the development that comes in from companies are the only thing that is actually going to be able to give them that development. They never contested it. They never responded to that. So that stands as well. We're the ones actually protecting minorities. We're the ones upholding equality, and we're the ones giving the best productive land use. So proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks, and I now call upon the opposition reply speaker to conclude the case for the opposition side. You're here.
Now, the problem with Team England in this round was that they just asserted that minorities and status quo felt represented and absolutely pleased with the way states were acting. Why was that assertion problematic? Because I don't think that Muslims in India or African Americans in the United States would feel very confident that states would be acting in their interests if the state was the one landowner under the side of the proposition. Especially when them acting, when that state acting in those individuals' favor was also going to mean them acting in favor of their base of their limits. This was what England barked all of the material on this round, and that's where that lack of analysis, lack of engagement cost them the debate. Two things in the speech. Firstly, on incentives and what landowner comparatively has better incentives, and then lastly, on whether or not the principle could ever really win them the round. Now, in terms of states, non-exclusive to prop on either side of the house. Arguably, if you have a state that in general is just democratically accountable, we think you can also push for things like making sure that you have a stable economy, these kinds of things. We think you can absolutely get there without revoking property rights. With that out of the way, let's see what the state. They told you, A, that it could be held accountable to the people, and secondly, that the board that was going to be implementing these leases, having control of these leases, was going to be so out of public control that like they wouldn't have to cater to any government. Firstly, because even in a world where these boards were perfect, where they were held in account by populations, I think this would probably not look like the affirmative, like good kind of leases for minorities that they claimed were so important. Even like good leases for homeless people or for poor people. I don't understand that if this board was accountable to the public, why it was that was a board to the needs that given the immense task of this leasing system, this would probably most likely, and I think they themselves could see like probably look accumulating wealth, that you had so much to gain from owning land. Thus, I think that if you have an elite board somewhere, it is very likely that wealthy people are going to capture that board. They're going to have massive incentives to pervert the ways and the whims of that board, especially if you have a subjective metric like things like, oh, we are going to assess how long your lease is case by case. So I think the benefits in these countries were seriously not responded to and were not defended extensively. But what else did we tell you? We told you that in states around the world, government's pursuit of power often manifests in deviant and malicious ways. These were states that they also had to defend. I think I had about 5 lines of engagement with that. The question you must ask yourself is whether or not you want to give these states more power to exploit, to oppress, to discriminate. The horrific examples that they tell you were horrific, things like in Rwanda, things like in South Africa, right? The discrimination of allocation of land. These were taste testers of their world panel. This was when the state came in and allocated land, when my private property right was abused and taken away from me. That was going to happen to a much larger extent under their side of the house. I think comparatively, we just proved to you that the state was a much worse actor in actually allocating land. Just very briefly at the end of this into the principle. They tell you that the most important thing is not owning land. But I think the second they supported a system of long leases where people could still exploit this land, where people could still use it in a way as if it were owned, that principle largely fell the second they gave us their model. For all those reasons, I think we were the side of pragmatism and the side that actually defended the vulnerable individuals that were so important this round, proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the proposition reply speaker to conclude the debate for the proposition team. Here.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Team Denmark wanted to have the debate they planned in their prep room. They didn't listen. We conceded from our first speech. Nobody could protect Uyghur Muslims. Nobody protected African Americans in 60s America. What we told you is that property rights were unjust, resulted in rampant homelessness, and most acutely affected the minority groups that they talked about on their side. What we told you is that in the current world, we could have protected the 1.6 billion people who live with inadequate housing. 2 questions in this speech. Firstly, which side reduces homelessness? Secondly, do people have a right to own the land? On reducing homelessness, right from the outset of my speech, in the introduction, I told you about the 1.6 billion people who lived in inadequate housing. They never dealt with that very basic fact that the private market had allowed that to happen. They raised some objections which were secondary to this. They said the government was inefficient. They never weighed that off against the numerous reasons we gave you as to why the private market was inefficient. They never weighed that off against the reasons we told you the very existence of the private market means the government can't do this, means that land prices are pushed up, means that there are people who own homes who lobby against the building of new homes because it preserves their wealth. And strangely enough, they rely on that very same government to administrate all the same things they talked about. And we also presume on side proposition, they relied on unelected bureaucrats to run state healthcare systems, which we told you very clearly can happen in countries like Ghana, where the government accepts responsibility for healthcare because it is said they have a duty to provide universal healthcare. Notably, they never showed why all the things that they supported on my side, all the government interventions, were actually plausible. Then on racial discrimination, we told you we'd have an independent board. We told you this would look like the Supreme Court, this would look like the judiciary in Brazil, which has consistently stood up to the government, to Jair Bolsonaro. And we told you this is one different mechanism. We conceded that the army would probably be doing a lot of this anyway. They told us property rights were the bastion against this. We don't think property rights was the bastion against this when you have systematically been denied those property rights, when you have been stopped from owning that housing and the army is going to march in and remove you anyway. What mechanisms did we give you? We told you we would fundamentally change the way people think about homelessness, that they would see it as a government obligation, that the government can no longer blame the private market, and they would see it as their responsibility. Is an election perfect? Is it waving a magic wand? No. If we get 0.6 of those billion people off the streets, those are 600 million people no longer having to fight in slums every day just to have a roof over their heads. We were very happy to stand for that on side of proposition. Does anyone have a right to own the land? What do we hear from them? We hear that our side has to be a commune. We told you very clearly the government will hold this land in trust so that people could have it to live and enjoy it. And that in that way, everybody can access it. They told us about government misconduct, and yet on their side, claim they didn't have to support any breaches. They completely ignored the way that corporations have perpetuated these abuses for years, the way that the government, in pursuit of private land and wealth, have perpetuated these abuses. What they didn't engage with is that all states around the world have a duty to do this. We recognise some governments might have done healthcare racistly. The American government might have done it like that in the 60s. That doesn't change the fact that their principal obligation to do those things. We told you, while those 1.6 billion people don't have adequate housing, the state has an obligation to do this. That is an obligation we stood for on side proposition. I'm very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank all speakers for what was a really excellent debate. The judges will take some time to, well, not take that much time because of course we'll get in trouble, but we're going to move into a different room and discuss, and we'll come back as soon as we can to share our decision with you. Well done, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the round.
Yeah. Celebrate, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.